Okay, we
When,
are recording. Go ahead.
Great. Good morning, everybody. This morning we're going to hear from Carrie Jennings of the of Freshwater, and she's going to be talking about siting large industrial water users with groundwater in mind. This seems just like such an appropriate topic right now, given everything that we've been hearing about data centers, the siting of data centers, and how much water we are talking about using for some of these facilities. Carrie was originally going to talk to us in our Waters and Watersheds conference, but technology being what it is, she was unable to give us that talk because of technical difficulties at that time, and so we prevailed. We prevailed in getting her to give this seminar to us in our water issues venue, and that is why she is here today. It is great to have you here, Carrie. A little bit about our speaker. Um, she is the Research and Policy Director at Freshwater, where she says she has been there for 11 years or so now. And previously, she worked at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources a little bit ago, right? And was responsible for scientific and technical standards for groundwater availability and sensitivity maps and reports. In her 24-year field geologist career at the Minnesota Geological Survey, she mapped the glacial sediment layers in no less than half the state. Carrie is an adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota in Earth and Environmental Sciences, where she has taught glacial geology for 30 years now. Carrie, it is great to have you here, and we are really looking forward to your talk. Why don't you take it away and run with it?
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to try to insert as much geology as I can into this talk because I feel like it's really an important, geology in general is really an important backdrop for this topic. So I'm going to talk about the policy and practice for siting high volume water users. I'm going to talk about how it was going down last year, how I'd love to see it change. Is everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about what Freshwater does. Um, Research and Policy Director, I do water research. It's fairly pragmatic research, and often it is directly implicates some kind of policy recommendation that we work on at the Capitol. And then we also have an education and engagement arm, and we have a program that you might have heard of that is kind of like Master Gardener, but it's water stewards that are sponsored by watershed districts. And we used to be metropolitan focused for that work and kind of stormwater oriented, like rain gardens, where they're capstone projects. But increasingly, we're trying to be in greater Minnesota and think about private wells. And then our new executive director, Michelle Stockness, likes to say we like to try to communicate, coordinate, and collaborate across sectors. And so that means our partners are going to vary by region and by whatever critical action we're working on. And I think we were engaged early in this conversation about large water users because we had 5 years of funded work on groundwater governance. And I want to start out and just describe groundwater governance to you because it's more than just agency enforcement. It's really about people and their institutions like PCA, and then the various jurisdictions that collaborate. You start with laws and policies, and you're managing shared groundwater. Groundwater management is what our executive branch agencies do. You are the practical implementers of those laws, policies, and decisions. I think a lot of times it it's people are confused about what the agencies actually do and think you have a lot of leeway in interpreting what you're doing, and I know that's not the case. So our work on groundwater governance was across this region, EPA Region 5, and we were originally charged to describe the system of groundwater governance in this area surrounding the Great Lakes because the Joyce Foundation, the funder, wanted to see if it was adequate to support the Great Lakes and then water challenges that might be coming down the way. So we ended up with a report that summarized the science, the hydrogeologic knowledge production, what the current institutional structure was in each state, including tribal institutions, the different approaches to governance and the challenges. And Jen's in that picture. A lot of these interviews were happening during COVID, and we met for the first time with our groups from Wisconsin and Ohio at a conference at the end of COVID. We followed that with a second phase of work, still funded by the Joyce Foundation, and we chose sticky areas to work. We chose this, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but this Indiana, Ohio, Michigan triple boundary with an aquifer that spans those jurisdictions and includes the Noticepi Band of Potawatomi. We were looking at kind of the elephant in the room, the big drawdown that's happening in the Chicago suburbs, northwest of Chicago. We were looking at the lowest yielding counties in north central Wisconsin, Vilas County, and met at the Lac du Flambeau Reservation. And then we kind of tagged on to the Met Council's process in Southwest Metro and met in Scott County. So what we were trying to do there is bring together all of the different levels of government and entities that were sharing groundwater and saying, hey, how are you coordinating this? Turns out nobody was coordinating in any way. So we see the groundwater governance as having these critical parts. You have to understand it first, you have to have the science, then you have to have the legal instruments, the permitting process and rules as the agencies like yours are enforcing, and then the stakeholder participation is key to any kind of governance. And that's probably where most states were lacking. And this all seemed like an academic exercise until data centers came on the scene a little over a year ago. And then suddenly people started asking us to kind of weigh in on this topic of how do we think about sharing this groundwater? And this is a very clear case where the speed of business was much faster than the speed of policy. And because of unbeknownst to us, we just became a target for these water-intensive industries. And I want to emphasize that I don't want to talk specifically about data centers, even though that's a picture of one, because there's other large water users that are looking at Minnesota as well. Water bottling plants, green hydrogen. I heard the ratio of 400 gallons of water to 1 gallon of green hydrogen. I've looked at a few science papers. It varies somewhat, but there's some other really water intensive industries, including sustainable aviation fuel, that could be coming our way. And 20 and what's been happening is cities are approached directly and asked for a share of their appropriation. Often the decisions move very quickly because this is a highly competitive business market. Cities felt like they needed to sign the NDAs that were offered to them. And the other challenge was that these issues became emotional very quickly. We know what solutions might be for these. They're technical, but then the decisions that are made are political. And so I'd say this is another kind of challenge that Kelton Barr described that is just, you can apply it to almost any issue, you know. So if you get an emotional stakeholder group, it's hard to make the right decisions and circle back and address that early emotion. So what was happening when we were finishing up our groundwater governance report is we were getting questions from city administrators from weird places. Like this is the greater Rochester area on the left. Town of Byron called us up, Stewartville and Lewiston, and they were like, say we're approached by a data center, what do we need to be thinking about? And then we were getting calls from places like Hampton and Cannon Falls and just think Northfield. Northfield was one of the first places that asked me to give a talk. It just didn't make sense from a groundwater perspective to me. And you know, they were thinking about their electrical grid, but they did wonder if they should be asking more questions about water. They didn't know what they didn't know. And especially outside of the metropolitan area, where there isn't a Met Council, they wondered who's helping us plan regionally for these large water users. It started making a little more sense to us when we were told to look at these maps of the grid. This is transmission lines and fiber optic cables. And if you start looking at where the largest transmission lines are, all of these communities that were approached start making sense, from Becker to North Mankato to Byron to Pine Island. They're on the lines. And if you're not on the line, then you weren't approached. And we verified that this was what Kimley Horn was looking at when they were considering sites and development of sites, as they were looking at transmission. and other factors that had to do with proximity to metropolitan areas so that you would reduce the latency of delivery of any information that was stored in these data centers. And what was the other? Oh, land prices, certainly. So Freshwater likes to kind of lean into these areas of tension, and we have an engineer as our executive director who probably gives a different flavor of talk than I give as a geologist, because we're presenting different sides of this tension of balancing economic development with this need to ensure future water for our communities and our ecosystems. The typical development process today, and I would say until some fixes were proposed last year, and I know there's more in the works in the legislature this session. I hope we do get a little bit more help. But what was happening was DEED is Department of Employment and Economic Development, and they were the ones being approached by industry, and they were helping cite the projects in their different regions. The municipalities then were approached directly and asked to, look at their industrial parks that they had already zoned potentially. And this is when the non-disclosure agreements were signed. And they were talking mostly about land use and power initially. They were usually given a short timeline and ultimatum, like we're also looking at your neighboring city, and so you got to decide really quickly. So this is unusual pressure, especially on small towns that have like a 5-person city council and not an engineer on staff. And when they signed the NDAs, they were often reluctant to ask state agencies or their SWCDs for help. When they reached their agreement, then maybe after a year of negotiating, that's when the project went public. And what was happening usually was that the entity was requesting to connect to the existing municipal water supply, not drill their own well. So that bypassed any evaluation by the DNR. And then that's when you started getting reactions from the citizens, the water managers, DNR, Met Council, regional planners. But there's really not a lot to do at this point. But the possible adverse outcomes really were that the cities were lacking decision critical information on water availability and impact. And we've seen with large industrial water user like in Elko New Market that now the radius of impact is up to 8 miles. It's impacting over 800 private well owners. So you can, if you're on the urban fringe, you're going to impact more private well owners than if you're completely rural or completely urban. People are worried about the impact on their water and electric rates, and the city is potentially saddled with expensive infrastructure unless they know enough to say that, have a community benefits agreement that says that they don't want to be saddled with that, whatever is built for the city or for the plant. We do have protection in Minnesota unique to Minnesota. It does not extend across EPA Region 5. We have some of the strongest water law in the area, and we prioritize water use in that domestic water supply and power producers with contingency plans have first priority of use. This is in case of water scarcity, then small users, then ag irrigation, then power production without contingency plans, then other large water users, and then non-essential uses of water. This is where large industrial water users should fall. But what was being confused, and maybe the cities didn't understand it, and maybe the pressure's not there yet, but in the event of scarcity, the cities will have to make those industrial users fifth priority and have plans to decrease their water. We know in one instance that the city has signed a contract that they will not decrease the water to the large water user. So cities either don't understand this law or this is going to be a legal issue for them going down the pike. So what the issues we saw last year was that these projects were moving faster than planners could react. The cities need data and tools to evaluate their regional long-term water sustainability, but weren't really sharing with cities around them or asking for help from state entities. But instead, we're very attracted by these short-term incentives, which is, they're either going to develop with rooftops or industry, and that helps with the tax rates for their people. And that's kind of the math. Those are the equations the city administrators are playing with. They didn't do community engagement usually, and it was kind of a challenge to think about who you should engage with. The one example I'm thinking of in Pine Island, I don't know what kind of community engagement the city did beforehand, but I know they didn't talk to the Prairie Island Indian community, which owns land adjacent to the 90-acre site that is being proposed for development. So the fixes that happened last session, and these kind of started being discussed mid-session, and it was really hard to come up to speed on it for the legislators who were engaged in all kinds of other conversations. But there is a new legislation that suggests that Minnesota Business First Stop is a place to coordinate and share data. This is I think DEED convenes this group, but it includes the commissioners of all the executive branch agencies. So Commissioner Kessler's on Minnesota Business First Stop. It has a new definition for large-scale data center for their electric and water usage. We're trying to get that language changed to just water user. We don't, water and energy user, we don't want to restrict it to data centers. Requires pre-application with the DNR if you're using more than 100 million gallons per year. They're supposed to be reporting more transparency in the water energy use in the pre-application process, but this is difficult because a lot of times the applier for this permit is a developer, not the end user. So Tract is a common developer, and they're giving wide ranges of energy and water use because they don't know who's going to go in that building they're building eventually, and they don't know what their technology is. And then here's where I think we fall short. We're just encouraging conservation and encouraging renewable energy, but we're not requiring that or linking that to any of the tax incentives that we still offer these businesses to come. So for me, I'm going to kind of focus in on the groundwater governance piece and those kind of different factors of groundwater governance and say, we need to really be asking questions about what is our distribution of usable water, who's already using it, are there other concerns with high volume water use, what are our societal priorities, this is the stakeholder engagement piece, and are there alternatives? And because this was EPA Region 5 wide, and the problem is really region wide, I'm showing you these slides of, on the right, the first available bedrock aquifers. If it's white on that map, that means there is not a bedrock aquifer of sedimentary rock that is reasonable to support a medium-sized city. So we're looking at southeastern Minnesota, and kind of that reddish color is the Hinckley Fond du Lac sandstone. So we're looking at Paleozoic and sedimentary rocks across the region. And fortunately, we have thick glacial sediment, the map on the left, over 200 meters in parts of western Minnesota that supplies the groundwater for the rest of the state. So this is an example from Ohio, but this could be someplace in southern Minnesota as well, where we have clayey till over a carbonate bedrock aquifer. And you can tell that the till is tight and there's no water in that, and it's probably protective of the bedrock aquifer, which has water moving along the horizontal bedding planes and the vertical fractures. So you can see water even seeping out in some places. So the system in southeastern Minnesota is colored as yellow for sandstone and blue for carbonate rocks. And on the right-hand column, you'll see the layered deposits of sandstone with shales, and then brick pattern is the carbonates. These are a result of epicontinental seas that came in and out and deposited at beaches, then offshore carbonate platforms, then went back out again. And so we have this nice stack of usable bedrock aquifers. Most places are using the Prairie du Chien group, the Jordan and the Shakopee, and these are kind of considered as connected aquifers. If you don't have those aquifers deposited by large oceans, then you're looking at stream deposits of glaciers, and these are much less broad, less thick, and they are not as organized as far as deposits. You have gravel and sand and silt kind of all in a deposit. So again, on the left, you can see where we have at least a thick stack of glacial sediment to choose from. The best case scenario is that you have a little bit of till at the surface that's shown here up on the Iron Range that's capping your glacial sand. This is a deltaic sand and protective of that aquifer. So how much is there and who's using it? Well, we're lucky to have monitoring wells in a lot of our areas of high groundwater use. And if you look at this, we have a lot more monitoring wells than any other state in the region. And they're focused on these darker purple counties where the high water use is. And I think you'll see that, Metro is pretty well covered, but it's actually not the inner cities. It's not Minneapolis, St. Paul, because they're using river water for drinking, but it's kind of each suburban ring out is more and more reliant on groundwater because they're getting away from those surface water sources. So we have a lot of monitoring there. And then we have a lot of monitoring in these high irrigation counties out in greater Minnesota. And DNR is monitoring this in one section and then issuing appropriation permits in another section. And those two groups are increasingly, coordinating and talking and making sure that they're not over appropriating groundwater. Groundwater is replenished just from rain these days, but it used to be from glacial melt. And, I don't have to say to you, I don't think that, it's like a bank account. You're taking some out, you're putting some in, and then you have a certain length of storage. There's some really interesting numbers coming out. And I think if you go to the Minnesota Groundwater Association conference later this month, they're talking about the age of groundwater, and Jim Berg has reported ages of 60,000 years in the Mount Simon down around Mankato, and then of course we have groundwater that's today years old. So it really can vary a lot, and I think increasingly we should start thinking about that water differently depending on how long it's stored. So the scarcity concern that we're seeing now in Minnesota has already been kind of outlined by the DNR with the groundwater management areas. Scarcity is a seasonal issue at this point in Minnesota. And if you look at all those groundwater management areas, they're all places where there's superficial sands that respond very quickly to drought and where there also is a need for irrigation. So scarcity is a concern like in Dakota County where center pivot is on some crops that are very high value and you're not gonna, and if you start having a drought in the spring or at some point during the growing season, you're gonna see irrigators doing a lot of water use. So even though what's happening in Minnesota going forward is probably not going to be a huge change in total precipitation, the upper map on the left, if you look at seasonal change in precipitation here on the upper right, you see more brown areas, so there's probably going to be less summer precipitation, and combine that with higher number of days over 90 degrees or over 100 degrees by mid-century, you're going to see more times of year when the crops are reaching their wilt point and irrigation will be necessary in the eyes of the irrigator. So we'll probably continue to see this seasonal water scarcity. When I think about groundwater, who's already using it and where the population centers are in this EPA Region 5 in the Midwest, I just look at this map of population density and think, makes sense to me. It's in places where you can either get water out of a Great Lake or a river. And then once you get out into those areas that were white on the bedrock map, you really are not finding the water to support large populations. And I don't think this probably is not the only driver for population, but it sure is a stark boundary in Canada where once you get up onto the Shield, the Canadian Shield, which looks a lot like our boundary waters, you're not getting high population centers except on rivers and lakes, just not supported. So I would say if you are looking of where you can do a large water appropriation, you have to be careful if you're very far from a surface water source. Because a data center is kind of like a city of 300,000 people. You probably should be wary of places where there's a mix of a lot of private well owners with the municipal well that you're going to be pumping from, because you have the potential to interfere with a lot of private well owners. I would say not a place where there's only glacial sediment aquifers. I was kind of surprised when they chose Becker because the first bedrock there is granite. And then areas where there's already seasonal water scarcity that are irrigated or drought prone. So that would make me be wary of siting in Dakota County. And that's where a lot of these last year were looking. The other concerns with increased pumping, and you know this very well in your role at the PCA, is the migration of existing groundwater contamination. When I show this map, by the way, people are just alarmed at how many sites there are. And you all know that this is just if you zoom in, you see a lot more dots. And so, we know that there's rules against migrating existing contamination. And the other thing is mobilizing harmful geogenic constituents. And Mindy and I were on a call earlier this week talking about how we really don't understand um, the mobilization of some of these things around high volume water users, but in the Elko New Market example where Niagara water bottling is, about 800 well owners are now impacted by increasing manganese in their wells, at least according to them. The city's not responding to their complaints, but we have radium and manganese and arsenic that are changing in the way they're showing up in people's wells, and for reasons that we don't quite understand. And this might seem a little far afield and academic, but I ran across this paper that suggested that groundwater discharge is now the leading contributor to sea level rise. So it's exceeding volume added by melting ice. So that should be motivation for us to try to keep it on the continent as opposed to the ocean. So that was who's already using it and what are the other concerns. The societal priorities for groundwater, who should we be talking to? It's those members of the hyperlocal organizations that we're hearing from now that are the first to see the impacts that are rarely included in the decisions from the beginning. And maybe because they haven't mobilized. But when a process is not transparent and inclusive, it is going to lead to fear and distrust. If you've followed it, all the situation in Farmington, it's led to a situation where the mayor quit and they have these explosive city council meetings. The people who are being impacted are private well owners who feel like they are the least able to afford this change. And so this, when you have a governance pathway that's not established, these groups are taking these varying ways to voice their feedback. There are several lawsuits happening right now that are stalling projects. They'll go for media attention. If they can, they try to figure out the formal environmental review process. But the people I've seen doing this, I'm thinking of two women in particular, they basically had to kind of stop their lives for 2 years, take money from their retirement accounts, figure out how to ask for an environmental assessment worksheet, how to fill that out, how to get legal counsel. It's really a difficult process for a citizen to do this. So a lot of times you'll just see people outside a city hall protesting with signs. This is, these people are, sometimes discounted as saying this is NIMBYism, but these are the people that government should be serving. And there should be an inclusive bottom-up practice that includes them, their opinions, their priorities, and then there's less need to revise or amend plans later. This is kind of what we're trying to do with a one-year project that's coming up ending in June with these 3 towns around Rochester. They were each approached individually and asked about data centers and kind of pitted against one another, but they decided to coordinate instead. And so the Humphrey School and the Law School and Freshwater are working with them to create a progressively larger engagement circle, giving them research and case studies on what other cities have dealt with inviting in data centers, helping them understand what their priorities are for their citizens, giving them a more proactive negotiating position when they talk to these large industrial water users, and then trying to help them think about the regional impacts. Right now, they don't want to talk to Rochester yet. They feel like they're on uneven footing with Rochester and Mayo Clinic, but they want to get their ducks in a row before they start talking about their need for growth and economic development as a Rochester urban area fringe. And then they want to make sure that they have a secure and water energy future. One of the hopeful things I see as for local organizing and governance and is that we already have organized around watersheds in Minnesota. The One Watershed, One Plan process has us organized around these Huck 8 watersheds, and the hard work's already done, which is the agreements between these different jurisdictions. I mean, if you just look at the Cannon River and see how many different county commissioners had to sit in a room together and agree on what their priorities were, those relationships have been formed and hammered out and they're in some kind of a memorandum of understanding now. The One Watershed, One Plan approach talks about groundwater too. So if we can just shift them to thinking about groundwater and surface water as a connected system, then I think we already have a shared governance approach in place in Minnesota. And I think this is where the PCA comes in more, is what are the alternatives to using groundwater? And I think if you're following at all the what Google is proposing in Pine Island and Hermantown and Meta in Rosemont, they're because of the pushback on water use, they're all using air cooling, which means the Pine Island, I heard the Xcel Energy CEO talking the other day, and he was talking just about Pine Island using 11% of the electricity in Minnesota. So if you don't use a lot of water, then you use a lot of electricity, which has water implications as well. But you can also use surface water. I would feel much more comfortable, and so would our funders at the Joyce Foundation who care about the Great Lakes, if we were using Great Lakes water or large river water, or even artificial impoundments, including the mine pit lakes. Early in this process, we talked to Commissioner Ida Rukavina up on the Iron Range, and IRRB commissioner, and she was supportive of some kind of development up there with the manipulated water in the mine pit lakes or even in the mines. They don't currently have the power or the fiber optic to attract those industries. But then reclaimed water, where we're already generating a wastewater stream or dewatering from quarries or structures like the air traffic control tower in Rosemont has a constant discharge, or discharging from industry. And this is where I think Met Council, maybe PCA, could help us understand the geographic distribution of these water volumes and what's available. The companies coming in are the ones responsible for treating it to the standards that they need to use it. So if it doesn't come out of like the Met Council's wastewater treatment plant clean enough, they can bring it up to that standard, and then they would have to, of course, treat it on the back end as well, but hopefully reuse it multiple times. And this is something that from a freshwater publication from years ago, and Jen reminded me that I started on the day that she ran a water reuse symposium at CHS Field, and this is kind of a CHS Field example. If we want to reuse water, we make it really challenging with our structure in Minnesota so that if it's stormwater, you all get involved. If it's stored in a pond, then it's a water of the state and the DNR gets involved. If people might encounter it, then the Department of Health gets involved because it might have Legionella or some other kind of health risk. And then if we want to use it indoors, the Department of Labor and Industry gets involved. And in this highly competitive, fast-moving market, you are not going to see a company voluntarily try to figure out this permitting path. It's just not clear or fast enough for them to say reuse is something they want to do, unless they're mandated to do it. And we clean that process up. There are some emerging market-based solutions that companies are signing on to voluntarily, and I think this is where we could see some leadership from some of these tech firms like Google, where they're voluntarily doing volumetric water benefit accounting and trying to have no net water use within their watersheds. And so when I was talking to the Lower Mississippi Watershed District yesterday, I was like, have your projects lined up, where you want to do wetland, recreating a wetland, or where you want to do recharge or storage, because it's potentially a good chance for Google or the large companies in engaging in this to do the water benefit project for you and then generate some credits that they can sell on a credit market, kind of like carbon credits. It's an emerging market, but it is there. And, we can expect more large water users because if you're listening about the snowpack in the West and what the rest of the United States is looking at, we are the ones that have the available water. It's not evenly distributed, so we want to make sure that our state agencies like the DNR and are making the relevant data available. And we have better mapping and monitoring than most of the states in the region. But PCA, it would be nice to have those stormwater and wastewater volumes by geography. So if anybody has that, I'd love to know. We'd like to make sure planners are engaging across these political jurisdictions, not just thinking about city boundaries, but developing shared tools and guiding regional development that way, and that cities are consulting their stakeholders and frontline communities to make sure they understand their priorities. And it is the role of the cities to do that. I wouldn't expect the state agencies to be doing that stakeholder engagement, except in rare cases. And then the state, I think, should be requiring and incentivizing the circular design instead of what we're doing now, which is offering tax incentives with no strings attached. I presented this to the Attorney General's task force, and I was like, what should the Attorney General do? I don't know. Make sure that we're enforcing existing law. address the agency fears of lawsuit, because I do hear that agencies are afraid to exercise the authority they have. Um, and they are being sued, and then to attend to these environmental injustice issues from communities lacking resources. And I think of the example of a community as wealthy as White Bear could afford to sue a state agency, and that lawsuit is still going on after 12 years. But there's a large water user being proposed for Inver Grove Heights, and I don't think they have the resources to stand up for their private well owners there. And I'm just going to put a plug in for the Water Risk Atlas that we're creating. This is the list of all the things I put in the proposal, that it's going to be an open source web-based platform. We want it to be for not the technical user, but the end user, the public, the regulators. We are going to use Minnesota's better, more granular information. It's going to be updated dynamically so that you don't just have a static map. It's not a substitute for environmental review or site-specific investigations, but it's a screening tool to direct water-intensive industries and growth to regions that can support the proposed use. And it is, we are developing it with the guidance from external advisors, and I'm building those advisory teams now. So this was funded by the LCCMR Emerging Issues Fund, and I'm working with a really cool water nonprofit called Shared Geo and the World Resources Institute. And we started March 4th. And stay tuned, because we'll have a beta product in a year. So thanks for inviting Freshwater. I'm going to stop sharing and see if I have any questions.
Thanks
I
so
see a
much,
lot in the
Carrie.
chat. Yeah, I see a lot of stuff in the chat.
Yeah, a handful of comments. Yeah, any folks who have questions, feel free to put those in the chat or raise your hands and ask out loud.
I see someone made the groundwater contamination atlas. Thank you. I think that's a really valuable tool.
While people
Yes,
are thinking
shout
of
out.
their questions, Carrie, I do have one to get us kind of kicked off. One of the things that is becoming apparent to me is when I hear about these data centers being proposed and people being concerned about them and so forth, it brings to mind the fact that most people don't even know what groundwater is out there.
Yeah.
When we hear about groundwater, a lot of people are thinking about enormous, vast swimming pools of water underneath the ground. And most people don't even understand what it is to begin with and what an aquifer is.
It's
I'm
true.
wondering if you can comment a little bit on what that means in terms of it seems to me that what we're having to face is not only a deluge of things like water use in data centers, but also trying to get um, our public and possibly our representatives up to speed on what groundwater resources really are.
Yeah.
And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, you don't really care about them until you assume water is coming out of your tap forever and that someone else is in charge. This has come across in many different public fora that I've participated in, including Water Bar, where we would do the water tasting of different waters and say, "Welcome to Water Bar, water is all we have." And people would pretend they're wine tasting, and then we'd ask them questions about, do you know about where your water is coming from? And they would just say the tap. They did not think about any kind of upstream source for their water. So you only start to care if suddenly your water turns gray and trashes your laundry, or you have to drill a new well. And then you might start thinking about groundwater. We're trying to do more with our water steward program in private well owners. Mindy's involved in a project that we're doing with well testing clinics around the state to look at arsenic occurrence in south central Minnesota. So I think, well, clinics are one of the ways to do this, public health. The Water Resources Center just added 2 staff people, only 2, maybe 3, that we're working with irrigators and then private well owners. And so I think there are some efforts and the health department, Tanny Eschenauer wants to have more focus on private well owners. So I think it's starting to happen, but yeah, even geologists, I would say, who don't think about groundwater don't always have a clear understanding of what's happening down there. So it's a problem. And, I don't blame people. They have enough stressors in their life. Um, wars, picking their kids up at daycare, putting food on the table, whatever it is, there's some things it's too much to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Emily had a question. What was the equivalency you noted for water usage in these centers? Was it a city of 30,000 people?
300,000.
300,000.
And I said medium sized to a group in Austin, Minnesota, and they're like, that's not medium sized, that's big. So yeah, I mean, it
Yeah.
varies by the technology. And certainly the ones that are going in now are instead just relying on air conditioning, basically. But the water cooled ones, that's kind of like a midpoint. It's hard to keep up with this. Apparently, the technology is evolving so rapidly, but then the companies also talk about it being part of their competitive edge. And so they won't tell you exactly what they're doing. But our funder, the Joyce Foundation, is doing biweekly updates on their website and trying to track not just data center development across EPA Region 5, but also the legislative response across those states. So that's really interesting to see, because some of the states that were inviting it in a big way, like Illinois and Ohio, are now looking at moratoriums because they're realizing that they're kind of maxed out.
All right. Leah had a question. In using air cooling instead, are there any proposals to decrease the amount of energy use or to offset that energy use? Similarly, in using surface water for cooling, what are the implications on temperature increases in surface
Yeah,
waters?
it definitely, so the energy use, the engineers that we talk to casually talk about modular nuclear reactors because the energy use is huge. Of course, we have a moratorium on nuclear energy in Minnesota. I hope that holds because there are people now lobbying to relax that. But it there are efficiencies that are being introduced, but people are saying we will need nuclear to stick with our green energy goals. I don't consider nuclear green. I don't think there's a solution for the waste. Surface water it does come out hot. Supposedly this doesn't violate our once through cooling ban because they're circulating the groundwater more than once through the plant. I think that could be challenged if a company proposed to do a pump and dump kind of design. But it does come out hot. What doesn't evaporate comes out hot and with concentrated solutes, and then anything else that picks up potentially in the plant. We don't know what that is right now. So it's going to require treatment on the back end, but it feels like it's going to require storage as well because it has to cool off. And I don't know how quickly these volumes of water will cool and how large that surface area is needed. So, how long you have to hold that stormwater pond. So yeah, there's some design challenges. Kimley Horn is the main engineering firm in Minnesota that's doing some of this design. Maybe you want to hear from them, or I can point you in the directions of some of the other engineering firms that have been on some of the same panels as I have been that are talking more about those designs. But people are worried about there's one data center in Norway that's in an old molybdenum mine, and they're saying it's underground, it's already cold, it's secure, but it will eventually heat up the ground too. Wherever you put these things, it's a heat island. It's generating a lot of heat.
All right. This was kind of an add-on to that question. You may have touched on this, but Jennifer said also, are there additional risks associated with reuse of discharge waters from industry and other sources in terms of temperature increase and contaminants?
Yeah, I think you're gonna have to treat, and they aren't saying exactly what's being introduced, but if it's direct cooling of the chips, it's gonna, potentially pick up something there. And I see someone asked about that 11%. That's what I heard on an NPR story. I think it was Tuesday, and it was the CEO of Excel used that figure 11%. And they were promoting
Okay.
how innovative the solutions were down in Pine Island because they're building battery storage and using some novel technology there. But yeah, the Minnesota Power, I'm just trying to look at that. It was an alert to me when Minnesota Power, it's not called Minnesota Power anymore, right? BlackRock owns it now. So that was a purchase made a year or so ago. And I feel like a lot of this has been in the works for a while. it's emerging on the scene now, but a lot of these large players have been thinking about this as the grid and electric usage gets saturated in other parts of the county. Like Virginia was kind of the first place where data centers came in a big way, and people are looking for places where the grid is not all, blocked, and they're looking more to the Midwest now for those reasons.
I think last one on kind of the temperature piece, are there impacts from temperature and increased volume impacts on surface water hydrology as well?
I'm sure there will be. And that's, DNR would have to look at that. I would PCA and DNR, right? Start their MPDES permits, and then also you have to make sure you're not overwhelming the receiving body, the receiving water body with different chemistry water. But yeah, I think I saw something about closed loop geothermal. That is kind of the preferred way to use groundwater, is just to not, consume it, but take the temperature of the groundwater and cool with that.
Okay, Scott says, I'm kind of obsessed by historical mega droughts in the past couple hundred years. The paleo record shows mega droughts that make the Dust Bowl feel like a minor hot spell. Any comment on what you think might happen if another mega drought happens?
Scott, I feel like I have the same obsession. Who is this? I gotta see who Scott who? Scott
Scott
Kaiser.
Kaiser.
I'm obsessed with it too because we had the mid-Holocene dry period where it was like from 4,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, where we had 1,000-year-long droughts, and the prairie forest border, that which we think of as kind of aligned with 94, up by, it's kind of Alexandria-ish. It went all the way over to Grantsburg, Wisconsin. So all the headwaters of the Mississippi River was a dune field. So up in Aiken County and around what's it called? Walker and east of there was all sand dunes, and now it's peat. So it definitely, yeah, I'm obsessed with that too because that could definitely happen again. The whole Anoka sand plain was blowing around. We have the dunes to prove it. And we think that if, just a little flash drought in the summer is bad. I think we're seeing this emerging in the West right now.
All right, I'm seeing a handful of comments about various things, no real questions right now. So again, if you have those, feel free to throw those
Yeah.
in the chat. Oh, Fox. How can we wrap data use, including AI concerns, into pollution prevention messaging? I know it's not great, but I still have like 35,000 plus photos of kids, dogs, and plants saved in the cloud. So
Well, what I tell people right now is that I know I feel guilty about my cloud hygiene, but that's being covered by the current data center assemblage, right? It doesn't require additional storage for that. Um, it's additional uses of AI that are being proposed, that are being forced on us, and that's and I just feel like yeah, it's the kind that we're not asking for necessarily. That is, as these are being designed and built for. These we are trying to say when we're doing a report that was generated without AI, we're trying to, and I try not to use the automatic note taker when I'm doing meetings on Zoom or Teams. It's just gets kind of annoying how it pops up and it's automatic now. BlackRock is evil. I'm just reading comments now. And Mindy says that the geochemical equilibrium, heat can change that. Solids can dissolve, absolutely. Yeah, I want to look at that Southeast Minnesota green energy transmission line because I heard about the one up in Hermantown. Eek. I scared Scott. Yeah, so I know that the role of the agencies is limited through your legislative authority and the rulemaking processes. But I think you can help make sure that the executive branch, your commissioner and the mayors or the governor knows what the concerns are. And I feel like Mark's group and others, you're studying these emerging issues and making sure those are communicated to the people above you. Yeah, they're being sold a sense of urgency that's not there. That's why we're trying to empower the cities.
Jennifer asked, and this isn't necessarily related to the presentation, but potentially someone on the call could chime in. Let's see, does anyone have good resources for turning off AI where we haven't asked for it? So certainly not related to the water
Yeah.
use and geology of it all, but a great question.
I'll just say
So.
one little thing I did was start using DuckDuckGo instead of Chrome, because it doesn't do that automatic AI search, the AI summary.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Oh,
also a
Ada
little more
asked,
protective.
any ideas on how citizens could protect themselves from the city councils making deals with companies that are establishing the data centers?
Yeah, they're hearing about it too late to protect themselves. But I do think that the citizen group that organized in the Farmington area, and they're the ones I was talking about that used their retirement funds and spent 2 years of their life working on this, they're increasingly being a resource for other cities, not even just in Minnesota, but across the country at this point. Coalition for Responsible Data Center Development. They're learning quickly um, how to uh, how to organize, and then they're suing. They with Castle Rock Township are suing the city of Farmington. So, it comes to that. So a search with minus AI. Oh, nice.
Yeah, I didn't know that, but minus AI, we'll get rid of the AI. All right. I'm not seeing any additional questions in the chat right now, so I think we can move to wrap this one up for this morning. Carrie, we greatly
Yeah.
appreciate your time this
Yeah.
morning. This was incredibly interesting. I think a topic all of us are thinking a lot about these days. And yeah, we just really
Yeah.
appreciate you spending your Thursday morning with us.
You're
Thanks so
welcome.
much, everybody.
And I think it helps me understand my title, Research and Policy Director. It's research policy. What are the implications? So thank you, everybody.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Bye.